Last year, I was lucky enough to walk away with my very first Golden Demon trophy at Adepticon 2023. And after putting myself through all the stress and hundreds of hours on that project, I told myself this year I'd do something a little bit more manageable. But after getting inspired by a new model that I just love and the amazing Golden Demon entries showcased at Spiel last weekend, I've made the irresponsible decision of attempting my biggest and most complex Golden Demon project ever. You know, my method for finding the correct piece for a painting competition is to not force it. That light bulb moment will happen organically when a certain model or idea speaks to me. Well, after months of looking and failing to find inspiration, I thought maybe this just wasn't meant to be for me this year. Maybe I'd take a year off and relieve myself from all the stress and hundreds of hours that would take to put into a project that I didn't really care about. But then, Games Workshop revealed this glorious rat bastard. Vizix Scour, Prophet of the Great Horned Rat, is a massive, glorious example of rodentia in its ultimate form. The sheer force of this daemon's diabolical zeal is enough to crack the land and drive Skaven swarms into a frothing frenzy. And with that single descriptive line, I could envision Vizix cracking through the city streets with each cloven step, ushering forth a vermintide the likes of which mankind has never seen. And that, my friends, is the inspiration I needed for this piece. First things first, I need to build Vizix to get an understanding of his size and pose. And of course, I'm immediately overwhelmed that he's a hell of a lot bigger than I had expected. And because he's a large model, I made sure to build him in sub-assemblies. In my experience, it can be very hard to get into hard-to-reach places and complete fine detail work on large models such as this. Because even in the model building stage, it's important to consider how you're going to approach the painting later. Because if I decide at a later point that I'll be fine gluing more of these sections together, that's easy enough to do. But I'd hate to realize that I made my life a hell of a lot more difficult than it needed to be with just a few drops of plastic cement. Now, Vizix comes with a 130mm round base, which I believe is big enough to hold one of those massive muffins you get at Costco. But I'm not going to be using that base included. I'm using a smaller display plinth, although it is still 100mm in diameter. I've learned that a tighter scene can often tell the same impactful story without giving the viewer too much empty space to lose interest. To figure out the details for our cityscape basing, I did some research online at Skaven Art, as well as looking through some Warhammer books. From there, I began some basic sketching, and I think one of the keys to this piece is the ability to create drama and natural pose with the single raised leg that Vizix has, as if he's standing on the top of the erupting vermintide as it spews forth. And it's at this point I had an eye-opening realization. This large plinth that I have for Vizix is actually hollow. So what if I flipped it upside down, carved into one of the sides, and used this exposed side of the base to help set our scene? But if I do this, there is no going back. I can't uncarve a hole, and I really have no idea how this is going to work in 3 dimensions unless I just go for it. And this is one of those things I've learned about competition painting projects. You end up doing something new, something you aren't comfortable with, every single time, whether you've planned for it all the way through or not. But if the idea excites you, just go for it. These uncharted waters are what help us grow, even if we don't know what we're getting into or how we're going to pull it off in the end. Because believe me, I certainly did not realize how much trouble that carving this hole was going to make for me later on in this project. Now, since I carved into the hollow side of the base, I need to create a lid of sorts to act as the actual part of the base that the model is standing on. I also need to build up the terrain off of this lid to create the raised perch that his hoof is on. This will be the upper section of the hole erupting from the side of the base, and before I figure out the final look, it's important to get the correct angle and height to match Vizix's posture. After having to say that name 100 times for this video, I realized how difficult a word Vizix is to enunciate. Vizix scattered the scurrying rats through the streets. I used some tin foil to hold up this milliput as I sculpt the basic shape, adhere it to our lid, and allow it to cure. Tinfoil is actually great for building up structures like this because you can pose it however you like as a support, and then once it's cured, it easily removes from the putty. From there, I decided to continue on more rough-in work, this time creating the basic shape of the cavern that's in the inside of our base. It's at this point that I came to the obvious realization that I've created double the amount of work for myself. Not only do I have to create the street level scene, but I'm also creating an entire cavern complex carved out by the cavern underneath the city streets. And it's entirely likely that most of this cavern work isn't even going to be seen. How much of it is going to be shrouded in darkness by the lid covered on top? I have no idea. And I'm not going to know until later, but because this is for a competition, I need to assume that it will all be viewable, even if it's by flashlight by someone that's really trying to catch every Easter egg of the piece. Now, for larger basic structure building, I like to use DOS air drying clay. This stuff is really quick to use and it's way cheaper than 2-part epoxy like Milliput and Epoxy Sculpt. It's not going to give us the level of detail as those 2-part epoxies, and you might get some minor cracks after it dries, but that's not really important. We'll use those expensive putties for all the detail work later on top of this clay anyway. I then use Epoxy Sculpt to carve out some larger rock formations on the bottom half of the exposed hole, but I'm not sure right now if I like these or not. I always find it's tough to tell whether or not I like how these first details are going to look because there's no frame of reference as none of the other details are done, so you're just kind of looking at a bunch of crap with one finished thing in the middle. But try not to stress yourself out too much in these situations. You can always remove these details, add to them, or tweak them how you like later. I also start sculpting the roof of our cavern on the underside of the lid, once again realizing how this is a lot more complex than I had expected this work to be. Because if I'm going to have any hope of getting in and painting the inside of this cavern, I have to keep this lid separate from the plinth through the entire project leading up to the painting. Meaning I'm constantly fitting the lid to the plinth to make sure that they fit snugly after every tiny bit of detail that I add, and I need this to keep a seamless look. This honestly slowed down the building of the project a lot and made me pretty frustrated, so I decided I needed a break and to move on to some other section of the project. Today's video is brought to us by Into the AM. And you know, they're known for their amazing graphic tees, but you'll notice I'm not wearing one of those today, and that's because there's a chill in the air. Stores are selling pumpkin spice everything. Pumpkin spice beef sticks. And that means it's also time for Into the AM's fall collection. Whether you're doing yard work, relaxing on the weekend, or even having a date night with your partner, the fall collection has that ideal mix of classy and comfortable we all can appreciate. I'm always wearing one of their flannels or hoodies while I'm out mowing the yard or chopping firewood for the winter, and their joggers are my favorite dog walking and movie watching pants. Really, the thing I appreciate about their fall collection is they work hard and wear easy. They're just so universal. No matter what I'm doing, I can slap them on and be good for the entire day. So be sure to check out the link below for all of the autumn options. And as always, you get 10% off no matter what you buy as long as you use my link. A big thank you to Into the AM. Now let's get back to the video. I feel like I need another small victory to complete some section to at least a mostly finished state, because I've been working on this thing for over 2 full days and nothing actually looks very good. So I think I want to get the street level cobblestone all done on the top of the base. And I'm going to lean on my architectural background a little bit here and try out a bunch of different designs with different size and shape stones to use for that street. One important detail that cost me a lot of money in buying the wrong size stones to figure out is that you're going to want to use 1/35 scale stones and bricks for this. That's the correct scale for Warhammer. Before I actually started building those streets, it was time for lunch. And while I ate lunch on this 3rd day of work, I rewatched the Skaventide trailer for more inspiration. I noticed that in this video, the Skaven had these gnarly structures coming up out of the holes and tunnels that they had built. They also have a lot of wooden scaffolding and walkways on those rat-built caverns, so I changed my focus to try to work on those details in the underground structure once I was done with lunch. I rolled out snakes with epoxy sculpt and used those to form a finished surface to the tunnel, and added some epic basing wooden bits to mimic the pathways the Skaven used in their own tunnels in the video. Now, some of the new Skaven kits, including Vizix himself, have those odd Skaven structures that are jutting out of the ground in the video as basing pieces in their kits. So I hacked a bunch of these up and tried different placement locations for them in my tunnel. I like the thought of one larger structure poking up out of the hole as if it's in the midst of raising up, just like the trailer video. I'm starting to realize that what felt like a massive tunnel and hole in the side of this base quickly feels smaller with all of these details added. I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. I still need enough space to add the rats swarming out later, but if this gaping hole is too large, it might feel a bit empty and distracting from Vizix, who's supposed to be the main focus of the piece. All right, with that distraction done, I'm feeling a little bit better about the interior of our Skaven tunnel, so let's return our attention to the brickwork on the street level. I traced out Vizix's footprint on the lid to get an idea of how much of this brickwork was going to be covered by his magnificent skirt, and it's going to be most of it. Which leads me to believe that I shouldn't have an overly complex menagerie of different stones on this base. It's not going to be seen, and the bits that will be seen on the sides will end up looking too busy if I build in multiple stone arrangements. The next problem we need to tackle is how we're going to adhere these bricks to the actual lid itself. Sure, we could just super glue them down, but then we're going to have some pretty deep gaps between each stone, which I then have to fill later and might end up looking inorganic or messy. But then I just thought, why don't I do what actual bricklayers do? And that's use some mortar. Digging through my tub of basing materials, I found I have a concrete basing paste that seems about as close as I'm going to get to actual mortar. So I just spread it in small sections, just thick enough that when I place each brick down, it squeezes the mortar out between the bricks. And for the first time in this entire project, I feel utterly satisfied by how something is turning out. Not only are the bricks set in place well, but we get enough of a realistic mortar or even earth-like texture between them, and it feels true to scale. I did decide to go with a herringbone pattern for the brickwork as I want something a little bit more interesting, and this design isn't entirely unusual for nicer medieval cities and castles. Now you'll notice in the footage here that I actually have the lid taped down with painter's tape to the edge of the plinth, and that's to keep it nice and firm. My worry was that as this concrete basing paste and bricks dry, we might get a bit of warping to that lid, so this way we get to keep it nice and flat all the way through the drying process. I'm also not placing the bricks all the way to the edge of the plinth. My plan is to do that at the very end of the project before I paint the street level. This way I can cut and sand those edge bricks so they're flush with the sides of the plinth. All this brickwork was honestly my favorite part of this whole project. It was really relaxing to just sit and place each brick one by one in that pattern and see it come to life, especially as we got up to the ruined section where his foot has heaved up the earth and all the bricks start to crumble and shatter from this newly formed Skaven hole. I'm also, for the first time in 4 straight days of working on this project, starting to feel a little bit of confidence that this is going to turn out okay. Up until now, it kind of felt like no element was more than 70% done, and I only had about 30% confidence that any of it was going to look good. And only when I blue tacked Vizix together, placed him on the base, and also just placed some rats around that hole to get a general idea of how it was going to look, that I start to feel like the vision was starting to come together. And don't get me wrong, this base still isn't complete. I still need to work on the underside of that city street, finalize some sculpting in the cavern entrance itself, and find the correct number and specific rat models to place coming out of the cavern and maybe scurrying out from under Vizix's cloak. but it's at least a really good start to this project and something that'll get a little bit of momentum going. And it reminded me how much work really goes into both the planning and initial execution stage of a larger project. So what I urge you to do is to go check out the Golden Demon winning pieces from Spiel on Games Workshop website. Take a close look at all of the base work. Notice how so many of them look so cohesive and effortless. And remember that all that work doesn't happen by accident. The most important part for me about getting this work done on this base is that it gives me some momentum. I'm now excited to see this completed, which means I need to start painting. Once I start on that and maybe get some feedback on this base design, I'll be able to go back and finish the last 15 to 20% of this base to really push the piece over the top. Thanks for joining me today for this first of what will end up being a very long project towards Golden Demon 2025. I appreciate that you're willing to join me for all the struggles, the frustrations, and honestly the fact that I generally don't know what the hell I'm doing. And for any mini painting project that you do, not knowing what you're doing should never stop you from trying. Just spending time at your hobby desk is more important than having the answers. You'll stumble your way through it, just like I do, and by the end, you'll be a more experienced hobbyist than you were when you started. And of course, a massive thank you for all of your support. I cannot thank you enough for subscribing, for using my links down below to pick up your hobby goodies at a discount, for picking up a Ninjon shirt, and of course, joining us over on the Ninjon Patreon. The patrons of the channel are truly my hobby heroes because you are the ones that allow me to keep doing this. I'll put links down below to all the ways you can support the channel. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to catch a flight to Vince Venturella's house for an epic weekend of hobbying and gaming. And you better believe that I'm going to start the painting on Vizix. But don't you worry, my little birdies, I will be back again for another new video next week. And sometime between now and then, make sure you find time in your day to slay the gray.